There are indicators the Justice Department probe looking into the origins of the FBI's 2016 Russia election meddling investigation is in its final phase. Attorney General William Barr appointed Attorney John Durham to head up the investigation last year. So far, it's led to one guilty plea from a former FBI lawyer, and just last week, a federal prosecutor and the top aide to Durham resigned from her post, though it's unclear why she left. This all comes as the investigation's finding could carry serious political ramifications with the presidential election less than 50 days away. Let's bring in CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge, who's been following every detail of this story. Catherine, it's good to see you. So bring us up to speed on the Durham investigation. What's the main objective of the probe?
Well, Vlad, the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut, John Durham, was tasked last year by the Attorney General to look into the origins of the 2016 Russia investigation, specifically whether it was properly predicated. And in layman's terms, that means when the FBI opened this counterintelligence investigation, did they have solid evidence that was sufficient to warrant the investigation of a political candidate and a political campaign? So that's what Durham is looking at. And he's a very experienced prosecutor. He's worked for Democrats, he's worked for Republicans, and he's handled other very high-profile investigations of the FBI, specifically corruption, as well as the CIA, which is also a player in the Russia investigation. John Durham looked into the destruction of interrogation tapes by the CIA of al-Qaeda suspects after 9/11. So he's used to both the FBI and the CIA, so he's navigated these issues in the past.
So then tell us where this investigation stands now. Do we have any idea when it may be wrapping up?
Well, I think there are 3 points, Anne-Marie, to sort of bear in mind. What we have heard consistently through our background reporting here at CBS News is that the goal was to release either an interim report or other findings before or after the Labor Day weekend. So we're right in that window. And then in the last 10 days, we've had 2 other developments. As you noted, the departure of this prosecutor who worked for John Durham. The reporting out of Hartford from the newspaper there is that she left because she felt pressured, according to her colleagues, to wrap up the investigation before she felt it was complete. We have not confirmed that independently, though, at CBS News. I think one of the most important data points came from the Attorney General himself last week in an interview with NBC News, and he was pressed on the timing. And I think for the first time, he would not be pushed either way as to whether it was imminent. And then he was asked whether he could rule out further criminal indictments in the Durham investigation. And he said, no, not at all. I'm not willing to do that. And that certainly left the door open to other criminal indictments in this particular case.
So, Catherine, who's been interviewed in the investigation and who has not? And explain the significance of that.
Okay, so if you think about an FBI investigation or an investigation by someone like John Durham, what they do is they start at the very bottom, sort of like with the little fish, if you will. They interview those people and they slowly work their way up the chain to the most senior people. And they reserve for the end of their investigation what is typically known as the targets of the investigation. So they sit down with somebody and they ask them questions that basically they already know the answers to. And if you think of it this way, based on what we've learned here at CBS News, some really central players have told us they have not been interviewed yet. For example, former FBI agent Peter Strzok told us last week he had not been interviewed. Recently, the former FBI director said he had not been interviewed. And at this late stage of the investigation, that's not necessarily a good development for them. If you think of it this way, it's like the promise next week, but you still don't have a date. It's not really necessarily good for you at that stage.
Well, the Justice Department has released some records showing that some members of the special counsel Robert Mueller's team actually deleted information from their phones. I don't know how significant that is, but what can you tell us?
I think the important place to start here, Anne-Marie, is with something called the retention of federal records. There are very specific laws and rules about maintaining and preserving government records. And the reason that matters is that if you go back to the Clinton email case, at its genesis, it was really about the preservation and retention of State Department emails. And that matters because many of the investigators who were on the Clinton email case transitioned into the Russia probe, so they were well aware of what the rules and regulations were and the expectation for preserving these records. And what was recently released through a Freedom of Information Act request request is an inventory of the special counsel phones. And some of the explanations here for the loss of data is that it was accidentally wiped. They entered passwords multiple times and effectively wiped the phones. Another was that it was a setback to the factory settings, essentially wiping a lot of data. I don't know what the explanation is for that, but it certainly begs further explanation given what the rules and regulations are for the retention of these types of records.
Catherine, as you know, Durham took the unusual step of publicly disagreeing with the Justice Department's Inspector General's report from December on the FBI's Russia investigation. Remind us what the watchdog concluded and why Durham's comments are significant.
So if you sort of dial it back to December of last year, the Inspector General at the Justice Department released his long-awaited report into whether the surveillance warrants for former Trump campaign aide were executed properly, and that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court was kept in the loop with all of the relevant evidence. And Inspector General Horowitz found in his report, aside from a number of defects in these surveillance warrants, that the investigation itself, Crossfire Hurricane, was properly predicated or properly opened. And what was striking at that time is that the U.S. Attorney John Durham put out a statement, and he said, I want to go to the language, because I think it's very important to pay attention to the language here. He talks about respecting the findings of Horowitz, but then he says, last month, so that would have been November of last year, we advised the Inspector General that we do not agree with some of the report's conclusions as to predication and how the FBI case was opened. And specifically, John Durham refers to the fact that he has access to evidence and intelligence that goes far beyond the Justice Department. So he has, in effect, he's arguing a fuller picture of what happened, whereas the Inspector General is confined to those agencies within the Justice Department, so the Justice Department as well as the FBI.
It's interesting stuff. I mean, I can see with an election around the corner why some may want this investigation wrapped up sooner than later. Catherine, always really informative talking to you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.